Okay, well, it is the top of the hour. I want to welcome everyone and thank you for attending this very important webinar. I'm Steve Parrish. I'm the co-director of the Center for Retirement Income at the American College of Financial Services, and with me is my co-director, Pfau, PhD. We'll cover CE momentarily, but I'm excited to get this webinar going. So let's talk a little bit about CE. What the deal is there is that this qualifies for CE for purposes of CFP and for the American College. It doesn't count towards insurance, and it doesn't count towards CFP. I'm sorry, CPE. Well, before I turn the program over to Wade, today, instead of having our co-authors of this great book that we're going to be discussing, Eleanor Blaney and Marjorie Fox, only Marjorie will be joining us today. Now, Wade's going to explain the circumstances here shortly, but I want to take a moment to address a topic that's related to this that we cover in RICP and that we covered in depth in a webinar we did last August. Call it what you will, call it diminished capacity, cognitive impairment, memory loss, whatever. But in our RICP courses, we identify 18 different risks that you can have in retirement. And 4 of them, and we're showing it here, are risks that are associated specifically with aging. So as Dr. Chris High reminded us in last year's webinar in August, the risk of diminished capacity increases with age. The hope in retirement planning is that diminished capacity doesn't happen, or at least it doesn't get in the way of having a happy retirement. But just like inflation, or just like sequence of return, it's a risk. It's a risk that should be anticipated, and to the extent possible, it should be dealt with in advance. So to that point, what we're going to do is, as a follow-up email, we'll send you a copy of an article I just published in the Journal of Financial Service Professionals on the topic of diminished capacity. You can see the cover here. It attempts to give you, as financial advisors, a number of tools and explanations for how you can address diminished capacity as part of your retirement planning process. Trust me, as someone who's facing the occasion of my 70th birthday in three weeks, I'm real cognizant of the importance of this issue. If you're a retirement planner, you really should be willing to address this very tough issue with your clients. So Wade, thanks for identifying the great resource we have in Marjorie. And can you please introduce Marjorie and get things going for us?
Absolutely, Steve. It's my pleasure. And thank you, Marjorie Fox, for joining us today. You co-authored a book with Eleanor Blaney, WomenWise. And so let me first introduce Marjorie, and then we'll read a letter from Eleanor about, as Steve was indicating, she's not able to join today. So Marjorie Fox, JD, CFP, is the founder and CEO of FJY Financial, LLC, a financial planning and investment advisory firm. Marjorie retired at the end of 2018 after more than 30 years in the financial planning profession. FJY Financial is known for its white paper, Implementing Internships, its merger in 2014 with LifePoint Financial Partners in Midland, Texas, and for an internal succession plan that succeeded in passing Marjorie's ownership interest in the firm to the next generation of owners. The firm was named a Best Place to Work by the Washington Business Journal in 2013, and the winner of the Schwab Impact Pacesetter Award in 2015. Marjorie served on the board of directors for the National Association of Personal Financial Advisors, or NAPFA, and the NAPFA Consumer Education Foundation. She was named one of the 20 most influential women to watch by Investment News in 2015, and in 2018 received NAPFA's Robert J. Underwood Award for Distinguished Service. Marjorie is a fourth-generation Californian who earned her BA from Pomona College and a law degree from UCLA. She's lived in Virginia for almost 40 years. Marjorie and her longtime friend and professional colleague, Eleanor Blaney, wrote WomenWise together in an effort to help single women make the most important financial and lifestyle decisions that they must make in their later years. So thank you very much for joining us, Marjorie. So this is a letter that Eleanor wrote to explain why she's not able to join today. So if I could take a moment to read her words. I am very proud and pleased that WomenWise, the book that Marjorie Fox and I wrote, is now published and available to women and their financial advisors. We're convinced that it will transform the retirement experience for women and make this period a time to be savored rather than feared. As Marjorie and I shift from the work of writing the book to the task of promoting it via speaking engagements, webinars, and interviews, I must reluctantly step away. Over the past several months, I've been struggling with memory loss that has significantly impaired my ability to speak easily and coherently on the many topics and recommendations in our book. The time has come to let Marjorie do the speaking for me. I take consolation in the fact that she will do this with consummate wisdom and professionalism. What follows for me is seeking treatment for this impairment and accepting and adjusting to what Marjorie calls the new normal in the chapter of WomenWise that discusses major life transitions. It is my fervent hope that there are treatments and remedies in the works that can address memory loss and restore my self-confidence and mental acuity. You can be sure that if such a cure or regimen exists, you'll soon have another Blaney authored book to help you and your clients sail through your retirement years with zest and enthusiasm. My best, Eleanor. So Marjorie, thank you for taking on this task on your own in what would otherwise be having two people discuss the findings of the book that you've written on this topic, but we're very happy that you're able to join us. And if anyone is interested to find this book, it is available on Amazon. If you search for WomenWise, and don't try to use the $ in the title, that will cause issues with the Amazon search engine, but the word wise, WomenWise, and then to be extra sure you find it, if you add either of the authors' names, you'll definitely get that as the first search result. Marjorie, to get to the questions that we have, so you, with Eleanor, have written a wonderful book to help guide women through the decisions they need to make for retirement. I'd like to frame our discussion today more in terms of what you wish you'd known when approaching retirement, and so how advisors can be more aware of these types of issues to help their own clients. So to begin with, could you share what motivated you to write this book?
Well, thank you, Wade. I'd like to say a few words about Eleanor because I've admired her for many years, but never more so than I do now as she bravely battles memory loss. It's been a very difficult year for her. I wish I had better understood what was happening. I wouldn't have been as frustrated as I was. Just about everyone, especially advisors and their clients and families with aging members, need to learn more about memory loss so they can help. To your question, Eleanor and I both wrote this book. One of the things that brought us together is we both write to understand. I wrote on various topics for my colleagues at FJY Financial. It's now Cerity Partners. To better understand these topics, Eleanor wrote Women's Worth in 2010. To quote Eleanor, women live longer and are more likely to live alone for significant periods of time. Our financial needs are different from those of men. It's time our financial advice was different too. We found many of the retirement rules, particularly Social Security, very complex. And what our role was to try to make them accessible and transparent to others. And having done so, it's enhanced our own understanding of how they work. Thus came about WomenWise, where we share our personal experiences and those of our clients. I stopped playing tennis decades ago. Pre-retirement, my only hobby was chairing the endowment committee at my church, a part-time job for roughly 6 months out of the year. I still do it, but clearly that's not enough to sustain me through retirement. So I was a bit lost after I retired in 2018 without my husband David, who died suddenly in 2016, and without my identity as a financial advisor and business owner. WomenWise was a godsend for me.
Yeah, thank you, Marjorie. And I think that really helps to highlight kind of an important issue here. about this transition into retirement and how really the non-financial aspects can matter even more so than any of the financial considerations that we usually look at. And so in that transition to retirement, I understand from reading the book, of course, that you lacked a clear vision about what retirement would mean for you. And that led to difficulties in the early stages. Specifically, you experienced a grieving process related to the significant losses that go along with leaving behind one's career. Are there ways that advisors can help their clients anticipate the potential loss that is felt with leaving one's career? And then you kind of indicated at this with writing the book helped you, but more generally, how were you able to get through that process of not having that career to really guide your days and decisions and activities?
Well, Eleanor, and sometimes she's just so funny and so spot on. She compares retirement to sending a child to college. Parents grieve, but when you send a child to college, as I have done, you're almost certain that your child will have opportunities to learn and grow intellectually, socially, and emotionally. College is a new beginning. With retirement, it's not so clear. Retirement is a reminder that you're in the final chapter of your life. Some retirees, and I'll include myself, were in such a rush to leave their job career that they don't look ahead to what's next. But at some point, we have to figure it out for ourselves and focus on where we're going and what we're going to do. Advisors can work with their clients to help them plan the next chapter and their new identity. I could have done more. In my case, with retirement in 2018, as I've said, I was no longer the owner of the firm that I co-founded, no longer the CEO or an advisor. And with David's death in 2016, I was single, I'm redundant, but I was no longer married and no longer a wife. And with my move in 2019, my new neighbors replaced the neighbors I'd known for more than 35 years. Out with the old, in with the new, just not very easy. So what got me through these overlapping transitions were my coach, Lisa Kirschenbauer, along with Susan Bradley, a friend and the author in 2001 of Sudden Money. Susan is known for the 4 stages of transition, and this all helped me. First is anticipation, second is ending, third is passages, and the final is new normal. Anticipation may last for many years in the case of an illness, or there may be none at all, and there was none for me. Second is ending, which include action steps that must be taken immediately or soon after the event. For me, it was planning a memorial service, writing an obituary, and paying bills. Susan, if you know her, is the founder of Sudden Money Institute, which began 18 years ago as a community of practitioners seeking to better serve their financial planning clients, as much in the lifestyle mode as in the financial mode. She created the Certified Financial Transitionist designation. An amazing woman. I'm beholden to both Lisa and Susan, and I wish I'd learned all of this while I was still an advisor. I would have better served my clients.
Mm-hmm. And in your situation, you've entered retirement as single, but one of the things that you do clearly outline early on in the book is just the demographics of, because women live longer than men, and because there's still demographically a tendency for women to marry individuals older than themselves, they're more likely to spend a longer period of their retirements single rather than as part of that couple. And living alone does create a number of challenges. Could you help to outline us what some of those particular challenges are of living alone, especially in the retirement phase?
Well, if I compare my life as a widow to my life as a wife, I can think of several challenges. I'm sure there are more that I face as a widow that I did not face as a wife. One is aloneness. Second is income, tends to be lower. Third are expenses. And fourth, life is just less manageable. And if I may illustrate with me, it's lonely, and the pandemic made it even worse. So thank goodness again for WomenWise. Income for me was lower. Sources of income like David's Social Security stopped, and although I received a survivor's benefit from his non-inflating pension, it was half of what he had been receiving. Now, he did leave me the assets and liabilities that were ours, and they were still mine, so that helped. Expenses can be higher, not all, of course, but many. David was frugal. I'm the spendthrift. He was skilled at home repairs, replacing wood siding, and so on. I am definitely not. So I've had to hire and pay for many of the things David used to do. Now, my spending for travel, entertainment, maybe not restaurants, but was cut in half. And that kind of leads to the fact that life is less manageable. If I'm able to, I try to do some of the things that David had done, especially after he left full-time work for part-time consulting. Shopping for groceries, well, I don't do a lot of that, but taking out the trash and recycling, figuring out whom to call when the pipes leaked, as well as trip planning, plane and hotel reservations, and so on. He used to do all of these. And I no longer spend the time I used to with couples, kind of back to the isolation at times and the loneliness at times. Couples who were our friends kind of drifted away.
Mm-hmm. Now, related to these issues, what we can see with the demographics as well is that when we look at which demographic group has the highest poverty rates, we see that it is women at more advanced ages, especially if you look at 10-year age intervals. So women 85 plus, I think, have the highest poverty rates of any demographic group in the United States. You're kind of hinting at some of the issues involved with that, and it's widowhood, divorce, a greater likelihood of being single, all factor into that. Could you also talk about some of the other potential reasons that we see that sort of discrepancy in our society?
Well, women historically have spent fewer years in the workforce and have earned less during those years. This has really been the case since the beginning. But it still may be the case today. A recent article last week's in Wall Street Journal talks about how college graduates compares college graduates who are women to college graduates who are men, and the women still start off with lower salaries than men do. So it hasn't gone away. Kind of secondly, as the old saying goes, women mourn, men replace. More men remarry, and if a man remarries, his second spouse may bring additional sources of income, maybe a Social Security benefit, and they bring talents. I didn't, but culinary to the marriage. Of course, if a woman does remarry, like my mother did at 74, the reverse can be true. It can be, role reversal. In my mother's case, the man she married after my father's death brought a larger Social Security benefit, a pension from the state of California, and a military pension from his service in World War II. Since she outlived him by a decade, my mother had a widow's benefit from all three. I have to say this is the exception rather than the rule, but it occasionally happens. And finally, financial literacy. Men tend to be more on top of financial topics such as investments than women. A study showed that women were more on top of Medicare than men were, but as a rule, they tend to be, let's say, less financially literate. Or maybe one study indicated that maybe it's just men who have more confidence in their financial skills than women do. And the research is not conclusive to that effect.
So it is important for advisors to prepare their clients to manage this kind of risk of, well, not necessarily poverty, but at least these issues that come along with the fact that with any couple, at least one member of that couple will experience time as a single person later in life. Planners do, though, have a tendency to focus on the joint aspects of retirement. It's kind of like that classic image we see of the couple walking along the beach, i.e. that time when both spouses are alive. But what could financial advisors do to better prepare women, and sometimes men, for the reality that part of their retirement will be spent living as a single person?
It's a good question, but I would substitute Wade and men for sometimes men, because we all know situations when the wife has predeceased the husband. So it's important, I think, to model each spouse as a survivor. And we at FJY, now Sarity, almost insisted that the wives joined the husbands in meetings, whether Zoom or in person, if at all possible. Sometimes it wasn't possible. So I agree with you that many advisors, myself included, have tended to focus on the joint aspects of retirement. Well, joint is the happily ever after scenario. It's more fun to talk about joint and live it. However, the reality is, as you said, one spouse will definitely outlive the other. I can tell a story on myself. In 2015, my husband David and I met with our coach, Lisa Kirschenbauer, and one of the advisors at my firm to model retirement. After David had seen the results of the joint retirement, he announced that he was going to cancel the insurance on both of our lives. He was tired of paying the premiums at 73. And he didn't think that we needed the insurance based on the results of the modeling. I recall kind of jumping up, I think I did, and I said, wait. You are frugal. I'm the spender. Long story short, modeling me as the survivor didn't produce the rosy results of the joint scenario. So David proceeded to cancel a policy on my life, but kept a policy on his, and he died a year later. Mm-hmm. I think how a surviving spouse, and we're going to talk about this later, but how a surviving spouse might spend his or her time alone in retirement is as important a topic as how the couple plans to spend their time if they're together. We'll talk about this, I think, a bit later.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, we'll talk about the time in retirement. Before getting to that, though, just a little bit of a different issue, but you also talk quite a bit in the book about elder abuse and the threat elder abuse can create, especially for single women in retirement. Do you have any suggestions on how advisors can help prepare their clients for some of those predators who are out there looking to take advantage of these kinds of situations?
Yes, one word, or I guess it's actually four, AARP. I mean, it should be the go-to resource for both advisors, their clients, and for consumers in general. First, a definition, and in the chapter, we go into all kinds of examples of elder abuse, but I'd like to read the the World Health Organization's definition. Elder abuse is a single or repeated act or lack of appropriate action occurring within any relationship where there's an expectation of trust, an act which causes harm or distress to an older person. Now, what's the definition of an older person? It really depends on who you're asking. The United Nations considers everyone over 60 to be older. Medical research often defines it as over 65. Steve, I'm sorry to tell you, but by any definition, you and I are now older persons.
This is not news to me.
Well, I just want to note one thing. Last month, the AARP Watchdogs Alert is what it's called, focused again on what I'm sure you've all heard about, the grandparent scams. The message of AARP is that scammers continue to find ways to put new spins on an old scam, and it is an old scam. Years ago, probably two decades ago, a widowed client called me utterly embarrassed and ashamed. She had sent $40,000 to a young-sounding man pretending to be her grandson. Of course, he wasn't. She'd been scammed. So I would suggest that advisors become very familiar with what AARP offers and bring that to the attention to the client. So both advisors and maybe the client could recognize a problem before it causes great damage. It's all about education, and AARP is a great place.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for that. Another issue is long-term care, and long-term care really can be a unique challenge for women with what we talked about in terms of the demographics. What may happen and is a likely scenario, the wife or the female in the couple may first take care of the husband with their long-term care event, and then eventually that individual passes away. And then later on, when this single woman now experiences her own long-term care event, she has no one to take care of her, at least not without financial remuneration or the need for paid long-term care services. So women really can have a more unique, stronger need for having the means to provide for their long-term care. What should women be thinking about differently when it comes to the conversation around things like long-term care insurance, or just how to think about the general issue of long-term care needs in retirement?
Well, you're right. Women often serve as a caregiver for their spouse and then later experience a need that is more likely to require a paid caregiver. So I want to talk briefly about three things: long-term care insurance, continuing care retirement communities, and the reverse mortgage line of credit as a way to address the costs of caregiving. First, long-term care insurance. But there are exceptions, but long-term care insurance tends to be more and more expensive. Unlike the time when it cost maybe $2,000, $3,000 a year for a lifetime benefit with a cost of living adjustment, not the case anymore. According to the American Association for Long-Term Care Insurance, the price of a new policy has increased 30 to 50% over just the past 5 years. So I guess the advice is, if you're going to pursue long-term care insurance, do it in your 40s and 50s, and the advisor should encourage that, but preferably in their 40s over the 50s, when it's both cheaper and you're healthier. Of course, the downside of that is you're paying premiums for many, many more years. There is something called shared care that reduces the cost. It gives a married couple the protection of long-term care insurance at a reduced cost. Each paid spouse, takes out a separate plan that has the option to put a rider on their partner's plan. When one spouse dies, the other spouse can usually access whatever remaining benefits their partner had left in their plan. So if the woman outlives the man, but it's also true if the man outlives a woman, the woman will have access to what's left of the man's benefit. Continuing care retirement communities, an alternative to long-term care. Eleanor recently moved into independent living at a CCRC. Going forward, if she needs additional care, assisted living, memory care, nursing care, she can move to that level of care without leaving the community. I now live in a townhome with exterior and interior stairs, but I'm also a depositor at a continuing care retirement community. It's under construction, so my move-in date isn't until sometime in 2025. Financial and medical underwriting were requirements of being a depositor. So if at the time if I choose to move into the CCRC and I require assisted living, memory care, or nursing care, I can move directly to the appropriate wing of the CCRC. Unfortunately, the deposit is refundable. So if I decide to age in place in my townhome, I'll get my money back. Finally, the reverse mortgage line of credit. As you certainly know, Wade, reverse mortgages have a number of uses for those who qualify. It can be monthly income, repayment of a traditional mortgage, purchase of a home, and also a line of credit. That reverse mortgage line of credit can provide funds to pay for care as long as you age in place in your principal residence. You must continue to pay the property taxes, insurance, association fees if there are any, and maintenance. Important to remember, and for your children or other family members to remember, that when you move out, if you sell, when you pass away, the line of credit must be repaid. But it's a great source of funds for somebody who plans to age in place.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the reverse mortgage is an interesting aspect of it. Let's hold off a little bit on, maybe if there's still time, we'll dive deeper into reverse mortgages in a moment. But there are a few other things I'd like to make sure we do touch upon. And one of those is the issue of budgeting and the emphasis that you and Eleanor provide in the book to do bottom-up budgeting, but really not just for the purposes of the budgeting process, but to really then focus on the needs and wants of that individual rather than the needs and wants of others, and how that might be part of a less bottoms-up approach to budgeting. So could you talk a bit more about this, please?
Well, I wish Eleanor were here, because in 2014, she wrote the Home Budget Workbook. It is a guide to many things, including bottom-up budgeting. So she compares top-down and bottom-up. Top-down begins with your pre-retirement income and subtracts employee-related expenses or deductions, such as payroll taxes and 401k contributions. And then certain additional expenses and retired are added. Bottom-up budgeting starts from scratch by itemizing non-discretionary expenses, both fixed and variable, and then discretionary expenses to arrive at your spending plan. Bottom-up forces you to focus on the expenditures that will be different in retirement than they were while you were working. Travel, maybe, entertainment, healthcare, gifts to charity, gifts to grandchildren, and I'm sure I'm missing something. I want to add something that Dan Vito talked about in a recent webinar. And he adds a very important caveat to discretionary expenses. He calls it the love of home, love of possibilities, love of family. These loves need to be examined to see whether there are expenditures that can be trimmed or eliminated. As an example of love of possibilities, my son and I purchased an RV in 2020 so that during the COVID, he wouldn't have to fly from Virginia, I wouldn't have to fly, but he didn't want to fly either, but I wouldn't have to fly from Virginia to California to visit him, my daughter-in-law, and my granddaughters. He drove the RV across the country and back, but we haven't used it since. Was this a good use of my retirement funds? I don't think so.
Fair enough. Now, another chapter where you have a lot to say is on the issue of Social Security. And in particular, you describe a number of unforced errors that can be made with the Social Security claiming process. Also, what you call the miss it by an inch, miss it by a mile rules that are part of Social Security. This may be a good chance to remind advisors of some important details that should never be overlooked when making Social Security decisions, not just at the point of claiming, but throughout the lifetime of that worker or couple. Could you talk a bit more about what these unforced errors are and the potential costly mistakes that are associated with those?
Sure. Unforced errors, at least as we think of them, are mistakes that you won't make if you take the time to understand Social Security. Some of the mistakes or unforced errors are: one, not reviewing your earnings record to know if a mistake's been made by Social Security or your employer. Two, not knowing what Social Security benefits you're eligible. Maybe it's a spousal. Come time, it may be a survivor, and then a benefit based upon your own earnings. Three is failing to sequence benefits to increase lifetime Social Security income. I went from a spousal to a survivor benefit, which Social Security automatically put me into after David died, and then I applied for a benefit based upon my own earnings. I think the one we talk about most is number 4, claiming benefits early. And there's also number 5, claiming benefits early and continuing to earn income. I mean, in most circumstances, it makes the most sense to wait until age 70, where you get the benefit of deferred credits certainly from when you retire if you retire at 62, but also from your full retirement age. If it's 66, as it was for me, that's 32%, 8% a year. If it's now 67 for those who are 62, age 62, it's 24%. We just really harp on the fact that if you don't have major health issues, if you have other means of support, then wait until age 70. Now, miss it by an inch, miss it by a mile rules are slightly different. With these, you come close to a benefit. You come close to minimizing income taxes or avoiding an increase in Medicare premiums deducted from your Social Security benefit. So we look at your work, ask you to look at your work history, your marital status. If you aren't married 10 years and then divorce, no benefit based upon your ex-spouse. Your employers, taxation of your Social Security benefit, and IRMA, the income-related monthly adjustment. And both Eleanor and I fell victim to that. Eleanor, because she earned a little bit too much in her final year of work, which put her over into another category of Medicare premium based on her earned income. And I failed in 2006, after leaving one firm and founding another. My income was much less in 06 and 07, but I failed to notify Social Security of that. And so, and actually for several years, David and I paid higher premiums, higher than we needed to.
Mm-hmm. Now, in Eleanor's case, part of that too is knowing that you can file. Retirement is a reasonable excuse to have your premium reduced, but absolutely that is one of those cases where you earn $1 too much and you suddenly face an extra $2,000 or more of Medicare premiums for the year. Moving on to the issue of retirement spending and developing a strategy to spend assets throughout retirement. The strategy that really excites you and is a big focus of the book, it's the dedicated portfolio theory developed by Stephen Huxley and Brent Burns, what they call asset dedication. And we do have a visual that helps them decide how that process works. We do include quite a bit of content about this in the RICP designation, because when trying to explain the time segmentation strategy, I think they have the most clear way to describe that. And indeed, could you discuss further about why you think this particular investing and spending approach may, in particular, appeal to women as a way to think about funding their retirement needs?
Well, I think this strategy, and I'll briefly describe it, or maybe not so briefly, but cut me off. Women who delegate, and I'm now one of those, will like it because it puts the burden on the advisor and on asset dedication to provide a predictable stream of income that matches the woman's spending needs. And I mean, that's huge in my opinion. Let me rip through this, but what you see here is the critical path. I'll get to that. First, a portion of the client's portfolio, say maybe 8 years of spending, is allocated to a bond ladder, where each rung of the bond ladder provides a year of anticipated spending. Coupons and proceeds of maturing bonds, and this is an algorithm, match the upcoming year's spending need. The balance of the client's portfolio is invested in stocks. At the end of each year, stocks are either sold or not to extend the bond ladder with another year's spending. It all depends on how stocks have done in the prior year. Now, the graph you're seeing is termed the critical path, and it shows whether the investment portfolio, growth minus spending, is keeping up with what it must do to prevent the client from running out of money before the end of her plan. Clearly, if it isn't, then adjustments in spending must be made. Now, this slide shows the critical path, the actual critical path of someone who retired into the 1973 bear market with $1 million in assets, and a desire to spend an inflation-adjusted $40,000 a year until the end of her plan. What you can see is in those early years, 73, 74, 75, and I was around for them, her spending, actually the portfolio fell. It rose a little bit, but still under the critical path, fell again, rose a little bit, and by the like 8th year was eventually above the critical path. And I mean, it's just amazing how, if you're patient, because patience through those 8 years led to a series of markets that just wouldn't stop. I mean, this is actually what happened in following the bear market of 1973. Now, asset dedication has fees, 35 basis points typically on top of the advisors and the underlying, say, expense ratios. And in my view, it has weaknesses or limitations. And those two really were one of them anyway. Inflation is what we're experiencing now, unanticipated inflation. I think it was 8.5% year over year as of July of this year. And that rate of inflation, and I'm living it, is much greater than the inflation that's built into the model. So in my case, the cash I've needed exceeds the cash available for a given year. And I think it's also important to think about unexpected expenditures, because asset dedication, I mean, they're unanticipated, they're not expected. So there has to be another source of income to fund them. And frankly, I think both a reverse mortgage, in short, is a great way to fund unanticipated inflation and unexpected expenditures. They have for me. So there's a lot more detail. I think Brent and Stephen Huxley would be a little ashamed of me for my very short summary of their strategy, but there's a lot more in chapter 9 of the book.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, wonderful. And yeah, it's really something that may appeal to those who like that sort of contractual protection behind knowing that they've got expenses covered for the next few years, but then having that optionality of the growth portfolio. With the questions coming in, I just note to the audience, there weren't slide changes for a while. We did have that picture of the book. So this was the first slide change in quite a bit, but actually now we'll transition back to show the book. There's not a lot of slides that go with the presentation. So we are getting a bit short on time. I was hoping to talk about reverse mortgages just because I know that you have the experience of using one yourself and finding it to be a very handy tool, especially the whole buffer asset concept of having a non-correlated resource to spend from during a market downturn. But let's kind of move past that discussion to make sure we do have time for questions from the audience. And then just a couple of other questions as we get closer to the end of this portion. You emphasize the importance for women to have a talk with family and friends about their wishes regarding a number of issues, but the dying process, mental infirmity, money-related conversations. What suggestions do you have for advisors to facilitate these conversations, or at least to help encourage their clients to have these conversations with their family members?
Well, I'd add legacy, Wade, to your list. We spent a lot of time in chapter 12 of WomenWise talking about how you increase the odds that those who are taking care of you or those who follow you understand how you would like to be remembered. But in chapter 12, we profile 2 free resources. And in the interest of time, I'm just going to name them. The first is the Conversation Project, which was launched by Pulitzer Prize-winning columnist Eleanor Goodman. And it requires you to think long and hard about what you need to say in this conversation. And it has you put this in your own words. The second is Death Over Dinner. What a name. It's really for extroverts and quick starters among us. It helps you plan an event around the subject of death. It's hard for me to say that with a straight face. It's designed to move you past the contemplation stage to the end goal, having the talk itself. These organizations are collaborative, not competitive. And as Eleanor says, they help in having the most important conversation that America isn't having.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful. And you do note as well that there's a chapter on legacy planning that we're not really diving much into beyond this conversation, but I understand a number of professionals have pointed out to you that this was one of the best, like, consumer-friendly explanations out there with the estate and incapacity planning discussion in the book. This is a broader issue of the topics covered, but the one, that last one on the list there, it's about time. I think that's worth mentioning because it's not necessarily intuitive what you mean by that. But in the introduction of WomenWise, you lead with your hope to help others find answers to questions that you and Eleanor were struggling with. And that includes, most important of all, what will we do with our time? So in the conclusion of the book, you do discuss the various ways to spend time in retirement and how you're spending yours. So could you comment a little bit more about how this spending, what all one needs to think about with regards to how they'll spend their time in retirement?
Well, some, and I'm one of them, think about retirement as a different kind of bucket to catch all those plans you never quite got to while you were working. So Eleanor and I let loose with the ways that we and your older clients might spend their time. Time to play, time to make the bed, which is a shortcut for taking care of yourself. Time to explore, travel, time to connect, time to say no, time to say yes, and time to inspire. Quick word about Time to say no, time to say yes, personal to me. I dithered after David had died and I'd retired about whether to completely renovate an aging house that had too much acreage and too many square feet and would have cost a bundle. I compared that to, well, I could sell it and move to a townhome. I ultimately decided to say no to a renovation because of the expense, but also because my son and family were on the West Coast. And it's not like we could live as a blended, combined family happily ever after in a multi-level house. That wasn't going to be my future. But I think it's important if you're going to say no to things, and I've said no, and Eleanor has said no to other things, it's very important to find things you can say yes to. And briefly, for Eleanor and for me, that yes was to our book, WomenWise. No regrets there.
Yeah, thank you. And so one last question from me, and then we'll open up Steve has been organizing some questions coming in from the audience. But you and Eleanor both have shared a lifelong passion to help attract more women into the field of financial planning. And that's actually a major focus at the American College as well with our Women's Center. So could you please talk a little bit more about how this issue has motivated you both throughout your career and then in retirement as well?
Well, after Eleanor retired from the firm she co-founded, this was a decade ago, she spent that decade at the CFP board. First, I'm sure I'm missing some roles she had, but I'm notably first as the consumer advocate, and then as special advisor on gender diversity for the CFP Board's Center for Financial Planning. This is a good part of her legacy. As for me, I've been involved with the NAPFA Women's Initiative. This initiative strives to attract, support, educate, and develop women as leaders within the financial advice profession, and to raise the awareness of the need for more female advisors. It's been stubbornly stuck at 25% women to 75% men for years. And as a co-founder, CEO, and lead advisor of FJY Financial, now Cerity Partners, I made every effort to hire qualified women as interns, associate advisors, and to promote associate advisors to lead advisor, and then name them to management positions and eventually ownership in the firm. I'm proud to say many of these folks are now professors, lead advisors, and owners of their own firms.
Wonderful, thank you.
Thank you.
So Steve, I think you've been monitoring. I've noticed a lot of questions coming in.
Yes, that tells you this has been interesting because we have some excellent questions, and I want to mention on the subject that we have here, we have another webinar coming up, well, really in 8 days, very related to that. And of course, this has to deal with how to attract Gen Z talent to financial services. So it seems apropos to where we're going. And in fact, one of the questions that came up that I would be curious to hear more about is what your practice was prior to retirement. Did you do much retirement planning, and did you learn some lessons in retirement that you might have wanted to have applied while you were a financial planner?
Ours was a fee-only firm. It still is as part of Cerity Partners, as I understand it. And we ran the gamut from education funding, risk management, insurance, estate planning, retirement planning, stock options, and then many more. But retirement planning became a focus of our practice as clients aged. And like we were aging, they were aging too. And I think I've covered a couple of the things in answering Wade's questions that I was really remiss about. I could have done a better job of educating clients about elder abuse, both the problem and those things that could be solutions making a retiree's life safer. So what else? I talked about, well, reverse mortgages can be great as a way of funding long-term care. I think asset dedication can be a good consideration or choice in terms of creating a retirement paycheck. And I've forgotten a couple of those right now.
The AARP resources probably.
Yes, AARP. Yes, AARP is a resource.
Well, here's a good question: is if the woman is the manager of the home per se, which often is the case, do you have any tips on how to mentor the husband, or it could be their spouse, but who doesn't handle financial matters, to be prepared for that time when the person has to handle those financial matters?
Well, I'm kind of an example of that. Even though David paid the bills, I was our financial advisor. Well, I should have been. I was a financial advisor. I'm not sure I was the best of educators. He lost patience with me sometimes because as a lawyer trained, I'd always go on the one hand and on the other. It would make him crazy. I think if you're the one doing the educating, you have to be patient. And you have to sometimes simplify. You don't have to go into all the detail. It used to drive David crazy. I'd explain the explanation and explain that. I'm sure advisors have other suggestions that they could offer.
Well, in a related question, the person points out if there's this large percentage of women who are never going to marry. So what recommendations do you offer as advice to this population, because they're in a situation where they may not have had a spouse handling this? How do they start preparing, recognizing they never were married?
The unmarried. Well, we make a point in the Social Security chapter when we're talking about benefits, plural, that someone might be entitled to, spousal, survivor, a benefit based on their own earnings, that if you've never been married, you really are only left with a benefit based on your own earnings. So that's kind of a technical. I think when it comes to lifestyle, I hate to say it, I think an advantage to never having been married, because you don't have that shock. And in my case, it was a shock when David fell and died. I mean, it just changed my world. And the unmarrieds, I think, have a better handle, and I know some of them as my neighbors, so I can compare myself to them, may have a better handle on all of these things, financial and lifestyle, than somebody who's lost a spouse either to divorce or to widowhood.
Oh, okay. I had another one that I wanted to ask. What was the book you referred to, written in 2001, that had to do with transition?
It was Susan Bradley's Sudden Money, and I met her in 2001. That's more than 20 years ago. And that's where she started. Book was about sudden money, the inheritor who receives an inheritance, the lottery winner, which there were more of those. But primarily those who didn't have any money and get a windfall. She's expanded into all kinds of other transitions. I don't believe she's updated her book, but on her website and on a YouTube segment, you can learn a lot more about this.
One other question we had asked by several people in a different way or another, but you were talking about the bond ladder. Have you used annuities as a surrogate for the bond ladder in getting the asset dedication strategy?
I haven't used them, but I think it's becoming a very valid alternative to a bond ladder. the advantage, I think, of a bond ladder is that you can engineer an inflation adjustment. And Wade, you could tell me, as far as I know, there really aren't many, if any, inflation adjusted annuities right now.
Right, not linked to the CPI. You'd have to just choose a fixed cost of living adjustment.
Right, and you could ladder annuities. You're the expert, but for me, the bond ladder works. But I think annuities, and I actually, in talking to Brett Burns, he's been very curious about the evolution of annuities as an alternative or replacement for a bond ladder.
Especially since you can do it both inside the IRA and outside of it these days.
Yes.
But I very much want to thank you both for a not easy conversation, but a very important one. Any final thoughts that you want to leave us with, Marjorie, before we call an end to it? It's just about the top of the hour.
Yeah, a final thought. I've been asked a number of times, well, why didn't you write this for men? And the book is relevant to men, but for all the reasons we've said over the course of this webinar and the reasons we give in the book, women are at a disadvantage. Earn less for fewer years, live longer, marry older spouses, etc., etc. And we're women. We tried to talk about the experiences we and women have had. So that made it a WomenWise. But I think there's a lot for couples in it as well, because one of these days, one of the members of the couple is going to be a survivor. So I think there's some good things for many of us who are approaching, let's say, late 50s, 60s, 70s. I've given it to a couple of young friends, and as far as I know, they haven't cracked the cover. So it's not for the young.
Well, as a husband of a certain age, I can attest to the fact that the book is very useful, irrespective of gender. So thank you so much for sharing your time, your expertise. Thank you, Wade, for asking these great questions. We will have a follow-up. There are a few questions that I'll be able to handle just in emails as we go, but we're very jealous of keeping time. So thank you for listening to this webinar, and we will talk to you next quarter.
Thank you both.
Yeah, thank you, Marjorie, and thanks everyone for joining.